Linda stood in her kitchen, holding the handwritten letter with trembling fingers. The afternoon light streamed through the window above the sink, casting sharp shadows across the granite countertop. Outside, the world moved forward. A delivery truck rumbled past, a neighbor watered their garden, a child laughed somewhere down the street. Everything seemed impossibly normal for a moment that would change everything. The letter was from Margaret, her ex-husband's current wife. The same Margaret who had smiled at her from across the bleachers at soccer games. The same Margaret who had brought casseroles when Linda's mother died. The same Margaret who had whispered to Linda at her daughter's wedding, "You raised an amazing son. Thank you for that." And now, Margaret had confessed something that could destroy it all. Linda had been cleaning out the guest bathroom, a mindless task she'd turned to when anxieties crept in, when she found it wedged behind the loose tile where she kept her emergency cash. The envelope bore her name in Margaret's careful handwriting. Inside, a letter began with words that seemed to shake the foundation of everything Linda thought she knew. "I've carried this secret for 17 years, and I can't anymore." The confession detailed a lie so profound it made Linda's chest tighten. During the custody mediation in 2006, right after her divorce from Robert, Margaret had been dadding him for only 2 months. She had overheard Linda talking to her lawyer about concerns regarding Robert's commitment to their young son, Marcus. The specific worries, reliability, emotional availability, follow-through, were valid concerns then. They'd been proven valid now. But Margaret had done something terrible. She told Robert about those doubts, framing them as even worse than Linda had originally stated them. She'd convinced him that Linda was planning to keep him out of Marcus's life entirely, when in reality, Linda had never wanted that. Margaret's interference had poisoned the mediation process. Her lies had shaped a narrative that made Robert fight harder, more defensively, more bitterly than he might have otherwise. The irony twisted like a knife. Margaret's actions had actually made things worse for everyone. Robert had become more contentious, more suspicious, less collaborative. The custody arrangement had been uglier than it needed to be. And over the years, as Robert had proven to be exactly the unreliable father Linda had feared, their son Marcus had suffered consequences that might have been mitigated if the initial separation hadn't been so acrimonious. Now Margaret was dying. The letter mentioned a stage 4 diagnosis. She wanted to make peace with her conscience. She wanted to tell the truth. But there was a problem, and Margaret had clearly wrestled with it. "I know this will hurt you to read, but the greater hurt would be telling Marcus. I know him. I know he would feel obligated to confront his father about this, to defend you, to carry anger on your behalf. It would complicate his relationship with Robert at a time when he's finally making peace with his father's limitations and his own past. I've been a coward about this for years. I don't want to be a coward now, but I also can't be the reason Marcus's tentative healing gets disrupted." Margaret's final paragraph was an apology wrapped in a plea. "I'm telling you because you deserve to know. You were always more honest than I was. You deserve the truth. But please, I'm asking you as a person who has come to love you, even if you can't love me back, please think carefully about whether Marcus needs to know this. Think about whether the truth at this point would serve him, or just burden him with a betrayal that doesn't change anything about his relationship with his father." Linda had read the letter 3 times. Each time, a different emotion had surfaced: rage, betrayal, sadness, and finally, most unexpectedly, a strange, complicated form of compassion. She'd been married to Robert for 8 years. She knew his capacity for bitterness, his tendency to feel victimized, his inability to see his own role in conflicts. She also knew something else. For the past decade, he'd been working on himself. He'd admitted to Marcus that he hadn't been the father he should have been. He'd apologized. It hadn't erased the hurt of the past, but it had created space for something new. Marcus was 32 years old now. He had his own family, a wife, 2 young children, a career he loved. He'd worked through his father issues in therapy. He'd told Linda explicitly just last month, "I've forgiven him, Mom, not because what he did was okay, but because I realized that staying angry was poisoning me, not him." What would revealing Margaret's confession accomplish? Linda sat with that question for 3 days. She moved through her routines, her yoga class, her book club, her volunteer work at the community center, all while the letter sat in her purse like a loaded weapon she could deploy whenever she wished. She could tell Marcus. She could watch him process the information that would taint his tentative peace with his father. She could be the hero of the narrative, the one who had always been honest while others manipulated. She could be vindicated. After years of being painted as the difficult ex-wife in Robert's version of events, she could finally show Marcus that she'd been right all along. She could hurt her son to feel less hurt herself. On the fourth day, Linda called Margaret. They hadn't spoken in 8 months, and Margaret answered like she'd been expecting the call. Perhaps she had been. "I read it," Linda said simply. "I know," Margaret replied, her voice small and tired. "I wasn't sure you would. I wasn't sure you wouldn't just throw it away." "I considered it," Linda admitted. "I considered all kinds of things." They talked for 40 minutes. Linda heard the exhaustion in Margaret's voice, the frailty that cancer brings. She heard the genuine regret, the wish to undo something that couldn't be undone. She heard a woman who had made terrible choices decades ago, who had faced them at last, and who was trying imperfectly to do the right thing now. "Thank you for not hatting me," Margaret said at one point. "I'm not there yet," Linda replied with honesty, "but I'm working on it." After they hung up, Linda made a decision. It wasn't one that would give her the satisfaction of feeling wronged or vindicated. Instead, it was one that would let her live with herself. Linda never told Marcus about the letter. Instead, she did something that no one would have predicted. She called Robert. They hadn't had a real conversation in over a decade. It was awkward and stiff at first, but Linda used the one card she had, honesty, and played it carefully. "I need to talk to you about something," she said. "Not because I want to blame you or make you feel bad, but because I think you deserve to know something about yourself. From someone who knew you well enough to understand it." She told him about Margaret's confession. She watched his face through the phone, imagined the shock that must be registering. She saw in her mind's eye how his defensiveness would rise, how he'd want to blame Margaret, to justify his bitterness as the natural response to being manipulated. And then Linda did the second part of her plan. "I'm not telling you this to make you feel guilty," she said carefully. "I'm telling you this because I think you've been building something new with Marcus, something real, based on actual accountability rather than playing victim. I think if you found out about this from Marcus, it would derail that. It would pull you both backward. But I also don't think you should carry around a false narrative about what happened in mediation." Robert was quiet for a long time. "Why are you telling me?" he finally asked. "Because," Linda said, surprising herself with the steadiness in her voice, "you're the only other person in this story who can handle it without it hurting the one person we both actually care about protecting." Robert came to Linda's house on a Wednesday afternoon. They sat in the same kitchen where she'd first read Margaret's letter. He read it himself, his face cycling through emotions she'd learned to recognize years ago: anger, shame, recognition. "I was hard on you," he said finally, not as an excuse but as an observation. "During the divorce, I was very hard on you." "You were," Linda agreed. "But I was also raising a child alone while working full-time. We were both hurt and defensive. This doesn't excuse how I treated you, how I poisoned Marcus against you." "No," Linda said. "It doesn't, but it explains something you've been trying to explain to Marcus for years, that you weren't the villain of the story, but you weren't the hero either. You were just a hurt man making hurt decisions." Robert looked at his ex-wife across the kitchen table and asked her a question that mattered. "What do I do now?" Linda had thought about this part extensively. "You make peace with it," she said. "You don't tell Marcus because there's nothing he needs to do with this information except carry a burden. You carry it. You work through it with your therapist if you have one. And you continue building the real relationship you've started with your son, the one based on who you both are now, not who you were then." Robert nodded slowly. "Margaret said something like that in the letter, didn't she?" "Yes. She's always been kinder to people than they deserve," he said, and there was something like affection in his voice. Then, after a pause, he added, "She's dying, isn't she?" "Yes." "Have you forgiven her?" Linda considered the question honestly. "I'm working on it," she said, "which is more than I thought I could do a week ago." What happened next surprised everyone. Linda made peace with Margaret. Not a restoration of friendship exactly, but something more real, an understanding between two women who had made mistakes and were trying to become better versions of themselves before time ran out. They had lunch together twice. They talked about Margaret's grandchildren, about books they'd both loved, about the unfairness of cancer, and the particular grace that comes when you're forced to examine your life. Marcus never knew about Margaret's confession. He continued his slow healing with his father. Robert never told him. Instead, Robert did something remarkable. He became a better version of the man he was, not performatively, for anyone else's benefit, but genuinely. He started speaking about his own therapy process openly. He made amends to his son not by dragging up old wounds, but by being present and honest going forward. A year later, when Margaret died, her funeral was surprisingly well attended. Robert cried. Marcus hugged his father and didn't understand why his father seemed sadder than he expected, but he accepted the embrace anyway. Linda sat in the back and held Margaret's daughter's hand as she eulogized her mother. She wasn't perfect, but she was brave in her own way. Linda thought about secrets and truth-telling. She thought about the power of information and the responsibility that comes with holding it. She thought about her son, who was happy and healthy and building a real relationship with his father, untainted by new betrayals to process. She thought about how easy it would have been to deliver the truth like a weapon, and how much harder it had been to hold it as a tool for healing instead. Not everyone understood Linda's choice. Her best friend Catherine had questioned it. "Don't you think Marcus deserves to know what happened?" "Knowing what happened doesn't change what happened," Linda had replied. "It just gives him new pain, and it puts him in the middle of an old conflict that he's finally escaped. That's not truth-telling. That's burdening someone with information that serves my need for validation, not his need for healing." But Linda's most profound insight came months later, when she was working in her garden and noticed something. The past doesn't have to be erased or rewritten to be healed. It just has to be accepted. Margaret's interference had happened. Robert's failings as a father had happened. Linda's struggles as a single mother had happened. These things were real and they mattered, but they didn't have to define the future. And sometimes, just sometimes, the most genius thing you could do was choose what information had power over your family's story. As Linda planted new flowers in the garden where she'd stood devastated just months before, she realized something profound. She'd given her son the greatest gift a parent could give. She'd protected him not from the truth, but from a truth that wouldn't serve him. She'd held the weight of knowledge so he wouldn't have to. And in doing so, she'd finally become the kind of woman she'd always wanted to be, not one who was right, but one who was wise. The letter from Margaret sat safely locked away, but not forgotten. One day, perhaps, Linda would tell Marcus. Perhaps when he was older, when his father had passed, when the narrative was truly complete. Or perhaps never. Perhaps some secrets were meant to be held and then buried with the people who carried them. Either way, Linda had made her peace. And in that peace, something that had seemed like tragedy, Margaret's confession, became something unexpected. A catalyst for actual healing, real growth, and the kind of complicated love that emerges when we choose compassion over righteous anger. The letter had confessed a secret. But Linda's silence had been her genius.